It is great to see everyone, some familiar faces, and I know we have a lot of new people to Olam joining this webinar today. So good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are, and welcome to our Aspire webinar on the ethics of working with children. So for those of you who are new to Olam or haven't been to an Aspire program in a while, I'm going to give a really quick overview of this program before we get into our speakers and the topic for today. So Aspire is a program, a holistic program that provides tools and resources around ethical practices in international development and humanitarian aid. At Olam, we believe that no matter how much of an expert you are, how long you've been working in the field, there are always things to learn and ways to grow, and always questions to ask about the impact of your work and the ethics of your work. If what you're doing causes any negative consequences, if you are really thinking about kind of the reactions of what you're doing. So Aspire program offers a few different things. You could see here the main ones on the screen. All of this you can find on our website, which you'll get a link to. So we offer microgrants to Olam partner organizations up to $1,500 a year, where you can hire a consultant or facilitate a meeting around ethical practices with your staff, bring in someone to do a training, for example, on the ethics of working with children or other topics. We offer lists of resources that already exist. We're not here to reinvent the wheel. So we are showcasing different documents and videos and tools that are out there. And we have other webinars and workshops. We have many recordings from the last few years on different topics. So feel free to check them out if you've missed anything and you want to see what else we've talked about. And finally, we have our ethical practices spectrum in 5 topics that we have decided to focus on, including ethical communications, ethical community engagement, climate practices, monitoring evaluation, and global volunteering. And each of these spectrums have 10 commandments, which are the 10 key guidelines for ethical best practices in these topics. So, for example, for the topic today of working with children, you can see, and children with disabilities, you can see 2 examples from our ethical spectrum where we mention related things. So, for example, in our community engagement spectrum tool, we talk about being inclusive and elevating voice of marginalized population in your work, modeling diversity, and making sure you are aware of your biases and assumptions, for example, around working with people with disabilities. So it shows what it would look like for an organization who is just beginning on their journey and what it would be to be a leading organization. So you're welcome to see more of this on the website. Another example that we'll touch upon is from our ethical communication spectrum, which is around getting informed consent, particularly for children or people with disabilities who are unable to necessarily comprehend the implication of sharing photos on your website or having their story told on your social media or in your newsletter, etc. So there are really different ways to ensure that you are getting consent and that vulnerable people such as children and those with disabilities are not being exploited. So with regards to the topic of children, there's just so much to talk about, not only in terms of the different ways that we interact with children in our work and the different ways in which children can be vulnerable, but also with the differences in age groups. So today we're going to focus a lot on younger people, but there are different ethical considerations and questions for working with youth, for example. So we're just going to touch on some of this broad topic. And I'm really excited to introduce our speakers today, who will give various perspectives on this. So we have Eric Rosenthal, who is the Executive Director of Disability Rights International, who will give a bigger picture and frameworks to think about when working with children and children with disabilities. And Sarah Wilner, Founder, COO, and Executive Director of the New York office of Early Starters International, who really focuses on work with younger children in humanitarian settings. So with that, I'm excited to pass it along to Eric and hear from you. So thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you very much. Let's see if I can share my screen here. Um, um, it's a real pleasure to meet you all, and I always enjoy opportunities to share experiences with practitioners in the field. And again, I always learn so much from hearing about the challenges, but the day-to-day ethical challenges that you face, and hopefully we'll have some time for discussion. Um, I run an international human rights organization that works for the rights of both children and adults with disabilities. Children in particular, children with disabilities face incredible discrimination and segregation from society. There are 10 million children around the world, and probably many more than that, placed in orphanages, psychiatric facilities, social care homes, segregated from society. Many of those children with disabilities grow up to be, as adults, continue to be segregated from society. There's been no international effort even to count the number of adults with disabilities who are locked away in institutions for their lives. So what we do with children with disabilities in their early years will impact them throughout their lives. Those children who are not in institutions face pervasive discrimination in many societies. They're kept in their homes. They're excluded from schools. In Kenya, where we work, we did a survey of families of children with disabilities, and the majority of families reported that they were pressured by their communities to kill their children with disabilities. There was such shame and stigma associated with disability. Heroically, I mean, we were very happy to find that the vast majority of parents wouldn't kill their children, and even without any domestic or international support, they kept them, loved them, and raised them, and that's the heroism that we see, and that's what support, the tiniest amount of support to parents who love and care for their children makes such an enormous difference. And if there's any one takeaway from this, the idea that not giving into that segregation and prejudice and stigma and supporting everything we can do for kids and their families to make sure they're part of society makes such an enormous difference. I'd like to start with just
Rick, I'm
two
sorry to
photos.
interrupt. Do you want to just put it on presentation mode?
Okay. I'm not sure how to do that.
The bottom near the minus signal, the bottom right.
Bottom right near the minus signal. I have to say, um, I don't have anything underneath my PowerPoint at this point. I can,
Okay.
I can stop sharing and go back to it. But can you see the screen with the two photographs?
Yes.
Okay, great. Um, so, um, when people with disabilities
Hey,
are
hey,
yes,
um,
hello. Oops. All right, can I continue? So when people with disabilities are segregated from society, this is a photograph of a 16-year-old boy named Jorge in a psychiatric facility in Paraguay. It's easy to think, looking at someone like this, that oh my God, they're in such terrible condition. They really could never be part of society. It's even easy to justify why we have to lock them up and put them in places like this for their own protection, because they would never survive in society. We learn the story of Jorge. He lived with his home. He had a diagnosis of autism, and his grandmother would walk across Asuncion once a week with him to bring him to doctors to get him some medication. And as she got old, she could no longer take the walk, so she left him behind in the psychiatric facility overnight to get his medications. And he became violent. He became upset. So they locked him in the cell because of how upset he was. Once he was in the cell, he started soiling himself. They took away his clothes because he was covered in his own urine and feces. Eventually, he, who had been, socially interactive, stopped talking entirely. And in this picture where we saw him, he had already been in an institution for 4 years, and he was literally living like an animal, locked behind bars in just horrendous conditions. Our organization took a lawsuit before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to sue the entire mental health system of Paraguay, and we were able to get a deinstitutionalization program. And we often think that these cost a lot of money. And in this case, they were able to give Jorge's grandmother a job as a janitor at the institution, cleaning the facility. And that amount of money was all it took for his mom, his grandmother, to be able to take him back in the family. The photograph taken at Wright was taken just a few years after he had returned to his family. He's there with his sister named Daisy. He started to talk again. He wore clothing. His family ran a little internet cafe, and he got a job at an internet cafe. So those before and after photos show just what the difference makes, how segregation is itself dangerous. It causes impairments. It creates disabilities. 10 million children in orphanages around the world is not just a tragedy as a result of disability. Orphanages are themselves, in a sense, a factory of disability. They create impairments. All the psychological and psychiatric evidence from research shows that if you place a child in, particularly at a young age, it can cause psychological damage that can be irreversible. Children learn to form emotional attachments at an early age. And if you take away that ability to form an emotional attachment, they may have what's called attachment disorder. They may not be able to form those attachments later in life. Even if you have a well-staffed, clean orphanage or institution, it doesn't matter. The fact that they can't form long-term meaningful attachments with a specific adult causes that damage. At older ages, we see developmental delays. There are some ages where they lose a month of development, of cognitive development for every 3 months in the institution. And even at older ages and among adults, people lose social functioning. You lose the ability to interact with society if you're separated from society. As a human rights organization, we document and we fight violence, abuse, exploitation, trafficking for sex, trafficking for forced labor. I could tell you many horror stories of what happens. And the irony is that these institutions are in theory there for the protection of the children. And what we find is that inevitably, even with well-meaning efforts to protect children are hurt by being placed in institutions. One of the most common misperceptions is that orphanages are for orphans. In fact, studies have shown that in various societies, 90 to 98% of children have families. And we've interviewed family after family. And one of the most heartbreaking things that we see is parents would love to keep their children if they could, if they had the tiniest amount of support to help them in the community. And usually it's not about heavy duty medical care or psychiatric or psychological support. Just some income support may make a difference, or transportation to the doctor. Parents would do anything to protect their children. And when we see discrimination against parents, we see, sex workers or even single mothers in some societies are punished by having their children taken away from them because they're not viewed as adequate parents. And so amazing things can happen when those parents are protected, and it's so important to do so. I just wanted to briefly give you the framework of international law. I won't go into it in detail, but that the idea that the right to family is actually an obligation. When countries ratify international human rights treaties, they promise to protect the right of children to live with their family. That is included in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But it's important to know that that convention was written in 1989 at a time when many children with disabilities and children around the world were placed in institutions, and it was assumed that because of their disability, they could not live in the community. So there are provisions in the Convention on the Rights of the Child that assume that suitable institutions are okay. If you only look at the children's rights standards, you may not know that more modern standards have been developed under the Disability Convention that say all children have a right to be in a family, every single one, regardless of their disability. What we now know is that no matter what disability you have, with proper supports, All children need a family. They can live and thrive in a family. And in fact, many models that were once thought to be alternatives to big, horrible institutions, such as group homes, are similarly dangerous. Any form of congregate care has a psychological impact on a child, whether that child has a disability or a label of an impairment or a disorder or not. You can take a non-disabled child and you put them in a group home. If they don't have those emotional attachments, all of the evidence shows that they will be damaged. And it's so important for international organizations meaning to help, not to perpetuate other forms of segregation and institutionalization. I just want to give some very quick examples from our work in Ukraine. Ukraine is a country where, we worked before the war. All of Eastern Europe has a very high rate of institutionalization. In the Soviet period, it was perceived that society could raise children better than families. And so they have a whole system of segregated baby homes, little babies put in institutions, social care facilities, boarding schools, and what's going on in those facilities is horrendous. The neglect, the abuse. At the time that the full-scale invasion from Russia hit, Ukraine had this vast system of institutions, and it shows one of the things that happens when you have a separation of families and children. When it came time to evacuate from war-torn areas, it was easy to get the non-disabled kids out. The disabled kids from the East were dumped into the institutions in the West that were already neglectful places. We saw overcrowding, lack of basic care, life-threatening conditions. And on the one hand, there has been an effort by UNICEF and others to start restructuring the system. But while that is going on, the kids in the institutions have largely been overlooked, and we see private efforts rebuilding those institutions. If you want an ethical dilemma, what we've seen is, international aid organizations seeing these horrors in institutions and thinking they can help. But when you provide staffing and technical assistance in an institution for kids, we saw a facility where, we found a kid whose parents lived 3 blocks away but couldn't afford to keep him. An international organization starts to rebuild the facility. That child was left tied to a bench in the facility where the international aid groups were providing physical therapy. If they had taken that money and gotten that kid back to his loving parents, he might not have needed so much therapy and he wouldn't have been left tied to a bench. These are the dilemmas that we see. We know people want to help, but it is so easy to perpetuate the abuse and segregation, and alternative models need to be created. We did a survey of more than 500 families of children with disabilities in Ukraine, and we found them struggling to survive. These are mostly families led by single mothers. Sadly, in addition to fathers going away to fight, families tend to break up. The mom says, I refuse to put my kid in an institution and I'm going to do whatever I can to protect them. And very often the husbands leave. So these are women-headed households with incredibly few resources. And despite the fact that vast amounts of international money have been going into Ukraine, we find that these families are almost uniformly abandoned. The services that existed in the community have declined, not gotten better. Transportation is available. There may be some model internationally funded programs, but if you live 3 floors up with no elevator and no accessible transportation, how you're going to get your kid with a disability to these programs is unclear. So we have to have targeted efforts to reach out to those families who are in desperate needs. They are the last barrier that is stopping these kids from being dumped into institutions and having their lives thrown away. We can make a difference. We work with activists around the world. It's not rocket science. There are incredible models for how to bring about change. And we'd love to be a resource to you if you have interest in finding out how to target programs. The International Human Rights Framework says that international aid must be developed in a way that it is respectful of the international human rights principles protecting both children and adults, which includes a right to a family and a right to be part of society. And yet in the United States, we find one study showed that $3 billion a year in faith-based money, most of that is Christian money, but a lot of faith-based money going from the United States to support orphanages around the world. That is a well-meaning effort to help those children. But if that $3 billion went to support families who didn't want their kids in orphanages, I can assure you that you would see very different outcomes. The Disability Convention includes Article 4.3, which requires a consultation with disability groups. As you plan your programs, you want to know what the needs of the community are. Please consult with disability groups. And again, we can help you find them and reach out to them. So thank you very much for this overview, and happy to respond to whatever your ethical dilemmas are when we get a chance to get into the discussion.
Thank you, Eric. That was very helpful to get an overview and really think about the risks that exist, and those numbers are pretty horrifying. I'll pass it now to Sarah from Early Starters International to get another perspective. Thank you.
Let me unmute and start my present. Is this good? Can you see? Yes, great.
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. I am really happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me, to Yael and Diona for inviting me to speak a little bit about the ethics of working with young children. And thanks, Eric, for that really incredible presentation. I learned so much. I will be speaking, as Yael said, about young children. We focus on young children 0 to 5, 6, 7. So that's what we'll be talking about today. My name is Sarah Wilner, and I'm the founder of Early Starters International, and I'm now placed in New York, leading our efforts here with the migrant refugee community. So Early Starters International is an educational humanitarian organization that brings back a healthy early childhood to young children in emergency situations and underserved communities around the world. We've worked all over the world, but at the moment, right now, we're working in 3 major crises. In Israel, after October 7th, we set up early childhood safe spaces for all the internally displaced children throughout Israel. And we continue to work in Israel in the border areas of Gaza and also in the north. In Ukraine, we're working since the war has started. We've been working around Ukraine, in Moldova, Czech Republic, and Poland, as well as within Ukraine, providing safe spaces for young children to grow and to develop. And in New York, we recently just arrived here a year ago, working with the refugees and new immigrants who have arrived to New York City and who are now living in shelters. There's over 200,000 new immigrants and refugees who had arrived here and who are now living in, who are unhoused and living in shelters. And so we've started working here, providing early child safe spaces for them as well. So I think Eric spoke about this a lot, but the challenges that, we can talk about the general challenges that children face in the disaster emergency settings. First of all, displacement and trauma, psychological stress, including PTSD, fear, and insecurity. We see behavioral changes like regression and aggression. We see developmental delays for many, many children who have been in emergency settings and have been displaced. We see a loss of stability in education, a lack of routine disrupts development, limited access to safe learning environments. And specifically with young children, and this is part of the reasons why we started Early Starters, we see that often in emergency situations, there's a huge investment in health and food and shelter, but the immediate needs, developmental needs of young children are often overlooked. And this is just as important as the other needs. And so this is something that lacks a lot. There's physical and social risks. There's increased vulnerability to exploitation, to child labor, unsafe conditions and trafficking. And there's isolation from peer groups and supportive adults. And something I would add also, which Yael pointed out, thanks Yael, is that the parents in these situations are often experiencing also significant trauma, economic instability, and the loss of their support networks. And these challenges can hinder their ability to support their children, to engage effectively in programs designed to help. So with the ethics of working with children in humanitarian settings, it's such a huge topic, and there's so much to talk about. And I'm looking forward to hearing, I think that we have dilemmas, daily dilemmas that we deal with every day. And I was trying to think about how to put it all together into one sort of, guideline. And I think it's quite obvious that we always act in the best interest of the child. We're, presented with significant ethical challenges due to everything I said, their heightened vulnerability. Informed consent is something that's hard to get, minimizing potential harm, respecting privacy. So we just really need to make sure that we are always acting in the best interest of the child, and this needs to be our guiding light. But as I said, I think that we are faced with ethical dilemmas on a daily basis, and we have a lot of gray areas where we're making decisions all the time in humanitarian work with children in some of the most complex and challenging situations. And so we really need to have, I think, we need to have a lot of empathy. We need to have careful analysis of the situation. And we need to make a decision that aligns with the mission and the integrity of our organization. So gray areas emerge in situations, like where conflicting priorities arrive, like balancing child's privacy against the organization's need to raise awareness. Culture and perspectives, differences between humanitarian workers in the community, they are an added layer of complexity. And as people who work in humanitarian projects, we are faced with these gray area ethical dilemmas every day. How to represent children, families, how to implement our programs. I will talk about these two pictures right here. This is an example of a program that we had that I worked in Mashav, which is Israel's Agency for International Development in Ghana. It was a really large project that we worked, and we trained early childhood educators in 21st century skills. So we really looked at the importance of problem solving, of expressing yourself, of curiosity, of creativity, and we changed, like, as you can see, the kindergarten class was changed completely into one where children can explore and can play. And it was really a wonderful program for the children in the kindergarten. As we saw, these children eventually went into a school system and into grade 1. And they encountered a school system that was very different culturally and with cultural and institutional values. Teachers and administrators viewed these behaviors where they were asking questions. They were questioning authority. They were considered rude and disrespectful. And this was obviously not something that we were thinking of, that this was inadvertently, we were setting up children for conflict. And I think that this was a huge learning point for all of us. We obviously had to change a lot. We pivoted our program completely to include the entire school system. We were working with the Ministry of Education, but we had to work with teachers in grade 1 and grade 2 and in all of the schools. We had to work with administrators, with principals, with the parents. We had to include a much broader program for these young children. And I think this is sort of like an interesting example of something that can happen inadvertently that we don't know. That we're making these decisions of what we think is best for these children, but we have these consequences which are everywhere. And this is just a very small slide, sort of talking about what I said. It's a monkey that says he sees a fish drowning, and he thinks it's a fish drowning in the water, struggling in the water, and he says, "Oh, this fish is drowning in the water. Let me help you safely up into a tree." And I think this is sort of gives a great analogy of where our cultural lens is something that we really need to be very, very aware of. We need to understand that we're coming to programs with our own cultural values that may be very, very different. And these include different views on children. So some guiding questions for ethical decisions, which I know help me and help our organization. When faced with the dilemma, we can ask these questions to help guide our decisions. First of all, the integrity. Will this decision uphold the integrity of our organization and its values? Does this decision uphold our commitment to the best interests of the child and align with our mission? Respect for the child. Is the child being treated with dignity, with care and respect? Are we honoring their voice, their agency and developmental needs in a way that supports their growth and well-being? Respect for families. Are the child's parents or primary caregivers respected and included in all decision-making processes? Have we considered their cultural, social, and familial context in the child's life? Safety and privacy. Does this decision prioritize the safety and emotional security of the child? Are we protecting their right to privacy, including mitigating potential future risks? Empowerment, sustainability. Are we empowering the child, their family, and their community with skills, resources, and knowledge to sustain the positive outcomes? And does this decision help build resilience and long-term support for the child? And finally, equity and justice. Are we addressing any power imbalances or systemic inequalities that might affect the child's access to opportunities or resources? And are we ensuring that all children are involved and treated equally without discrimination? I won't go too much into informed consent because I know that Aspire Olam did an entire webinar on informed consent. So I will say that, first of all, with informed consent, while obtaining signed consent is essential, true informed consent requires understanding, and parents and children should fully, children where appropriate, should fully grasp what they're agreeing to, including the potential implications. And they should always have control on whether or not they'd like to take down their pictures afterwards. And we really need to reflect on the bigger picture. And I think we need to be very intentional on the pictures that we choose to show, and how much more benefit it has in what we're trying, in the story that we're trying to show. It might, using a child's image might promote materials, might raise funds and support our programs, but we really need to make sure that, again, like I said, that we have the dignity, safety, and privacy of the child first. And it's important to say that young children can truly never give informed consent. So we should always have approval from their caretakers and their parents before using their image. This is the one image you'll see with the child's face, and it's actually my daughter. So, I think that here we have a clear case of informed consent where I have complete control over when that picture is being used, and I can take it down at all times, and I know exactly where it's going and what's happening to it. And I'm using it actually as an example to compare to the picture that's next to it. After October 7th, we went down to Eilat to work with all the displaced families who in the south of Israel who were there. And I brought my daughter there. There was no school, there was no one. So she was participating in all of the early childhood safe spaces that were there. And so this is actually the same space in one of the hotels. And the picture on the left is artwork. It's artwork, and it says sentences from children that are with a wish, and it says, the one on the bottom, for instance, says, please protect us, or this is a butterfly that's going to protect us, and the bottom one is, please have the soldiers protect us and our families. And I just use this as a way to say, I think that it's very powerful to use a picture that doesn't have a face. And I think that when we can have the opportunity to use pictures for materials and for our social media posts that don't, that can protect the privacy of a child, then I think it's important to choose a picture that can do so. We talked a lot about cultural sensitivity. I guess one thing I will add is that, we have varying forms of parenting and education community roles, and we always need to involve local caregivers. And that'll bring me to my next slide, and I think Eric touched upon this a lot, and it's really, really important, where caregivers, parents, grandparents, fathers, guardians, we need to prioritize working through caregivers and everything that we do when we're working with young children. The caregiver-child relationship is the foundation of a child's development. And we do not do anything without the parent or the caregiver. We need to align with their values and we need to build trust and promote secure attachment So I think we try to strengthen the caregiver-child bond. It's central to child's emotional, social, and cognitive development, and our interventions try to empower caregivers to nurture secure attachment. They come to all of our spaces. We have workshops, and we provide a lot of support for them. We involve all caregivers in co-creating our programs, so we try to actively involve them in shaping the activities and decisions that are happening in our spaces with their children. And building trust with caregivers is essential. So critical to creating a strong foundation for supporting children's well-being. We need to respect caregivers' knowledge, experiences, and authority, and their lived experience. You know, they know what's best for their children. They may not be experts in early childhood development, but they have a lot of lived experience, which we need to respect and which we need to tap into. So the last thing I'll say is, and then I think we can open it up, is balancing our perspectives. We need to recognize our bias and our values and how that's brought to whatever program we're working on. We need to collaborate, and we need to bring as many partners as we can into our programming. We need to be flexible, and we need to show humility. We need to be open to learning, and to understanding the cultural context that we're working in. And finally, gray areas demand thoughtful case-by-case decisions. There are no perfect answers, but we can focus on the core principles of integrity, respect, and collaboration to make decisions that will, prioritize the dignity and the well-being of children and their families. So thank you so much. This is my information. So if anyone's interested in talking about this more, and of course, we can looking forward to hearing all of your experiences.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I'll just note that I'll be sending out the recording and the slides for everything. So I should have said that earlier, but you don't have to take notes. We're going to have time now for Q&A, about 10 or 15 minutes, and then have a discussion about our own work and all of your work and how you engage with children, and what are some of the ethical dilemmas that are raised in your work. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and questions. You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask, or raise a hand, or put a question in the chat. And I also encourage you to turn on your camera so that we can have a discussion and see each other's faces. It would make it a lot nicer. So we did get one question in the chat. I'll start us off, and then I'd love to hear from others. But Eric, in terms of steps to take, if you are working with children in an orphanage, or your community is institutionalizing children, what are steps that people can take to help reunite children with their families?
That's a big question, and obviously depends a lot on context. Number one, very often institutions are aware of where the families are, and it may be that they're a few blocks away. And so if you can start making connections with children to the families that are there, the most low-hanging fruit is that when the families are around and it turns out, just ask them, what would you need to do to be able to keep your child at home? That would be a really great start. There are many different levels in which you could do this. And I know that, in certain circumstances where governments are not supportive, there are no social service systems, you may feel very powerless. So it may be that kind of talking to the local authorities and starting to work on the policy issues becomes important if there simply are no community supports or families that are around. Some of those legal and policy changes might be necessary. But start with the low-hanging fruit, see if those connections can be made. Every day in the life of a child is important. And, getting those kids back to their families quickly would really make a big difference.
Thank you. Would anyone like to ask or share from your own experience of working with children? Shoshana, go ahead.
Hi. You probably heard my voice earlier. I didn't mean to be rude. I just wanted you to click on the view tab in the PowerPoint. Sorry, Eric. What is it? So we have a girl. I'm with Tikva Uganda. We have a girl who's 9 years old, and she has epilepsy. And she has been completely unschooled her whole life because the schools in her area won't take her because of her epilepsy. We found a school that caters to special needs that will take her. They're a boarding school. It's too far away for her to commute. Outside of her going home at the end of each term, which is what we're definitely doing, thanks to Eric's research. What else could we do to help this girl? She's 9 years old. She's never been in school. What would you say for us to do to help her in school?
Well, let me just say, I'm a lawyer and not a service provider or an educator, and there are a lot of them on this call. So I'll hold back because a lot of you may have better ideas than me.
Sarah, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess I wanted to ask, what does she do? Where is she?
She's in a deep mountain village in eastern Uganda. A place with dirt roads and no running water, and very rural area is where her family lives. And so we found a school, and so we want to send her to this boarding school. It's a good school, but we want her to have that healthy emotional development also. And so what would you recommend for the supportive adults to help?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And the school is very far away. Is that right? The boarding school. Mm-hmm. Is there an opportunity for her parents to visit when she's there?
Yes, they possibly could.
Mm-hmm. And would she be able to go home like on weekends or?
On weekends might that's probably a hard to do. But at the end of each term, for sure.
I'm going to jump in.
Yeah.
I'm not a service provider and or an educator, but if she could go home, if you balance the interest in her having an education versus her interest in the emotional love, care, and support she'd get from being at home, my gut, and feel free to disagree with me, is that she would be better off in her home not getting an education than being in a boarding school, getting an education, and not having the love, support, and care of her family. I would keep her in her home and see what education you could bring to her. And there are international standards on this. Take a look at what UNICEF says about boarding schools. At young ages, it basically says that children should not be in boarding schools if they could be in their home.
Yafa, looks like you have something to add.
I think, Shoshana, I think what would be an important question is to really ask the child what she wants. and what the family wants. I mean, this is not a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, right? So really trying to understand what the child wants and what the family wants. I think that would be the starting point for me.
Yeah,
And then
but she wants to go to school.
well, then everything, yeah, and then everything that everybody else has said. I mean, if as Eric said, if there is a possibility that she could receive more something where she is living, that that could be the best of all worlds. But yeah.
This is a very particular case, so let's move on. I'd love to continue this offline. I'm happy to connect you, Shoshana,
I just
to
wanted to add that, sorry, I just want to add that I think that that what Rabbi Yaffa said and Eric is important, and including the caregivers and all of those, your parents and all of those decisions is really, really important, and seeing how we can support the parents and keeping her at home if it's in a way that we can, provide support and educational materials to the parents, and seeing how we can connect them maybe to other parents that are in the area that are also. I think that there's a way to provide something in her home and in her culture and her village that would I mean it would need a program, but there might, and I'm sure she might not be the only child. There might be other children like that also need. And if there's a way to connect them all together and create something that's, cooperative, but within their village, it might work. Sorry, I just wanted to add something like that. Okay.
Thank you. Shoshana, I'm happy to connect you offline.
I would like to share also something or to ask. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Ayelet, and I'm the founder of Halev Africa, which is an NGO that works with orphans in Tanzania. At the beginning, we located the orphans through orphanages. And through time, we understood that we need to bring the orphans to their families, to their villages. But now we have one boy that is left in an orphanage. And because the people that runs the orphanage, they're doing a business out of it, they are not giving us the boy. And, we have a dilemma because we have a support for this child, but we don't want the boy to go back to the orphanage every day because there are so many kids over there, and everything that we are putting in the studying and in the healthcare is go to waste when it goes to the orphanages. And, they uses him like another kid out of 40 to get donations. So I don't want to leave this boy and not help him. And I don't want to work with this orphanage anymore. What would I do?
Well, your point raises an extremely important one. The idea that orphanages are businesses, that kids are often used to raise money for the facility, that rather than the facility existing to help the kids, the kids are there to make sure that the orphanages can keep running. To my mind, you should. It goes beyond service delivery to a point of violation of this child's rights, exploitation, and abuse. If you could identify advocacy organizations, legal advocacy organizations, disability advocacy organizations, talk to policymakers, talk to the press. I mean, the range of options needs to be there. We talk about respecting cultures and respecting local customs. Well, these are international human rights. These are the rights of the child. I don't think that if a child is being exploited for a facility to stay in business, that cultural sensitivities come close to the concerns of these fundamental human rights. Speaking out, going public, I would pull out the stops to do whatever you could do to protect this child.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
Eric, do you have any partners in Tanzania that maybe
I believe there are some very good groups in Tanzania. We don't work in Tanzania themselves. I know that there are good, fabulous groups in Tanzania working with children with disabilities. Don't know the advocacy groups, but if you put me into, if you reach
No,
out
but
to,
I have connections
yeah,
of
okay,
lawyers.
great.
I didn't want to
Yeah,
get into it
great.
before I decided what to do, but
Yeah,
maybe
yeah,
maybe I will give their advice. Okay. Thank you.
that's great. Thank you. Really important work you're doing.
There's a question in the chat from Temwa. How do we help the disabled who have no families, for example, in a case where all parents and grandparents are dead? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. That happens all the time. The idea of kinship care, that if it's not biological family, a grandmother, an uncle, an aunt, basically anyone who can form a committed emotional attachment, an adult who's willing to take the child, obviously within a system, of oversight. You're just not going to farm out the child, but adoption, foster care. Unfortunately, in most places in the world, foster care, where it exists, does not have supports for children with disabilities. So we often see non-disabled kids going into foster care and the kids with disabilities being left behind in the institutions. But the reality is that with a very small amount of support, foster parents can often take children with disabilities. So if there is no family and you have to create a substitute family situation and provide support in the context of the family, that's the way to go.
Thank you. In addition to questions, it's great to hear some examples that you're facing. Anyone else who's working with children, which I think is a lot of you, have you faced any questions, dilemmas, issues that you're unsure of how to deal with? Iris?
Thank you. I work at Cadena. It's an organization that helps people in crisis and disasters response. And I work in communications, and I sometimes feel that taking pictures of children, even if we have the caregiver's consent in those contexts, sometimes I feel that it's tricky. People, when their house is gone, or they are more inclined to say yes to anything because they're receiving help. And sometimes I feel that in that context, it's a little bit difficult to, even if you have the consent, to then use these pictures, even if it helps you raise money. So I'd like to know what you think about where the line is and how to do it in an ethical way.
Should I jump in? I think you bring up a really important point, and I think that the majority of the time you can take pictures without children. I know that there's this idea that it brings in more funds or brings in more support to have a picture of a face of a child. I'm not sure. I don't know. Okay, I've never done the research, but in our experience, we've been able to, I think, use pictures that they show a childhood. They'll show a picture, or they'll show the early childhood setting, or they'll show some activities, or you could show the back of children without, or their hands, their feet, without showing a child. And I think, like you said, they're in this very vulnerable state. Their parents don't know what's going on. They have no idea, that they're there, and they're supposed to have a safe area for them. And so they need to know that they're also safe from, their pictures being taken and posted online and not knowing where it's going. So I think that if we can use a picture that doesn't have a person or a face or a child, I think that's the best. That's what I feel.
We do that a lot. Thank you.
Yeah.
We do that a lot, but I feel that I feel pressure from the organization to show a little bit more children. I think, because it does raise more funds. So yeah, it's difficult to know where the line is.
Well, I mean, again, you have to have informed consent. So you can show a picture of a child. And if you are going to show a picture of a child, then I would say focus on the dignity of that child and make sure that you're representing that child in a way that is dignified and that is respectful and that is respecting them and their family. Um, and I always try to think of, well, you saw a picture of my daughter. I always try to think of what's going to be like in 20 years for that child to see that picture when they're an adult and they're going to say, wait a minute, who put this picture up and what am I doing? And do I want this picture up online forever? So trying to understand how that's going to affect them, not only now, but in the future, because every child has a right to privacy, and I think that that's a right that we really need to consider. I feel like when we talk to funders, and of course it's very different, but we're sort of a small organization and we're doing all of it all together. So we're also talking a lot to funders, and we have personal relationships with a lot of the funders that we're working with. And we tell them, if you want to come see what we're doing, come visit, come see it in action, see what we're doing. We have places now, in different places in the world. You're always welcome, and to just come and experience it.
Iris, I can add also that I'm always showing pictures of happy kids. I never show them suffer or where did I brought them from. And
I love that.
Yeah, and if the donor wants the story, I will tell him the story, but I will not put a picture and tell the story online. It's not going to happen. I always think about your own kids. And all the pictures are happy pictures of the staff in Africa, the kids from the neighborhood, and also the kids that are being supported. But nobody can know exactly whose kid is what. So this is how I do it.
Thank you.
Iris, I'll put a plug again for our webinar recording on informed consent, because it really goes into detail in different situations. And one of the things that I like from the speaker there is about having basically a way that people can take away their consent. Make it very clear that if the parent today is saying, sure, put my kid up on your social media, but changes their mind next week, in 5 years, it's very clear for them how they can change their mind and ask you to make
take
changes.
it down.
Yeah.
And I want to add an example to that. So important, Yael, because we had a consent to use a picture for someone in one of our spaces, and then they had to go back to their home country, and they were really afraid that their pictures were up online. They were scared, and they came to us and they said, please take down all these pictures that you put up of us. And it's really important to know that there's a way to take those down, and that the person who's consented has control over that we never forget that it's their picture.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Kylie, did you add something?
I guess it's interesting to listen to, and we also face some similar challenges. And I was thinking of situations where we were running a program in Ethiopia with South Sudanese refugees with children, and we wanted to have a photo of one of the kids to explain what we were doing. And it was really hard because even though it's a teenager and they kind of give their own consent, we didn't feel it was enough. So we went to find the family, and then we had to bring a translator to translate what does consent mean. And we're in a little mud hut in a refugee camp. They don't even know what social media, how can they consent to something that they don't even know what they're consenting to? So first you've got the language barrier, you have the concept barrier, and then you also have different family dynamics. So it could be that the mother says, oh, that's lovely, we love that. And then the father's, well, he'll come home later from work and he might not consent to that. So it's just interesting to see how you can get a family consent, I guess, when there's two conflicting opinions sometimes. And then sometimes, the teenagers wants to and is very happy to, and then you've got the parents who may not want to, and the school. So we tried to make sure we also have an option of no. So it's not just a tick box and then they can tick it, but it's very clear that they can opt out. And we had to do it in 2 different languages plus English to make sure they really understand. But yeah, it sometimes can be difficult where you feel you've got consent to some extent, but not thorough enough to be able to use. And then you can't really use it unless there is sort of that full consent.
Thank you. Yeah.
So at this point with time, we were going to divide into small groups and have conversations, but I'm really happy to have this larger conversation. I think it's helpful. So please feel free to unmute and add questions. And I actually do want to ask questions on behalf of many of Olam's partner organizations who either send volunteers or, as Sarah said, or invite donors, or just a lot of this international development work is bringing in people from outside of the communities to the communities for a short amount of time. And what are your thoughts? What are some of the consequences or ethical questions around that, particularly children who are more vulnerable with disabilities or have attachment issues with people kind of coming and going out of their lives? I'm curious if you have thoughts on that. Eric?
Yeah, well, it's a very important point because, in addition to the $3 billion that supports orphanages, there's, just very large number of people who go and volunteer in these institutions. Volunteering is a great thing when it's done in a context that's supportive and kind of where the kids are. So there are kind of 2 separate issues with regard to volunteering. One is just making an institution into a better institution means it's more of a magnet for segregation. And the second thing is the access of the volunteers to the children creates risks for abuse. There is something if you do a search for the Better Care Network, there is a resource called Better Volunteering. So that if, we want people, volunteering is a very powerful thing to do. And the messages that people get when they see things abroad and they bring them home is really important. But there are guidelines on better volunteering for how to use volunteers, and it takes a very strong stand that there should be no volunteering in orphanages or institutions whatsoever. That has a negative impact and perpetuates a very dangerous practice.
Sarah, do you want to add?
Yeah, we don't really utilize many volunteers in our programs. But I will say that the volunteers we use who would like to volunteer in our program are usually coming from the same community where we're working. So they actually can really help connect us with the community. They're part of the community that we're working in usually. So they do provide a lot of support. We don't have international volunteers coming to our spaces. I think with donors, look, we all need funding. That's just how it is. And we need to show what we're doing. I think what we try to do with donors is just be very authentic about what we do and how we do it. We give very clear instructions about, what pictures can be taken, of course. We always have someone who is with them, showing them what's going on. So, and it's usually, everyone is usually very aware that there's a donor coming. And if no one wants to if parents or children don't want to be there when we have an outside visitor coming, then they don't have to be there. That's something that we try to implement. And we try to create, when it comes to informed consent, I suppose, we also try to create that consent when others are coming into our space. But I think volunteers, in our case, can be a great source of support. We have to just make sure that they are well trained and they're well informed, and that they are coming, they're coming for long term. We don't do like a 1-week volunteer program. They come and they volunteer for much longer.
Thank you. Any additional thoughts or questions or sharing from your experience? Okay. Eric and Sarah, any final words before we close?
Well, just yeah, Al, thanks so much. Really appreciate you pulling this all together. And really happy to be a resource. There's networks of disability rights groups around the world. And you know, there's often just a big kind of siloed gap between the children's programs and service providers and the disability activists. And people who focus on children often kind of can overlook the importance of adults, of adult disability activists in providing solutions. Because if we're going to integrate kids with disabilities into society, we need to have inclusive societies. So it really does mean reaching out to disability groups. Unfortunately, there's actually a lot more money out there for children's groups than for disability groups. Disability groups tend to be underdeveloped, underfunded, underrecognized in any society. So if you're working in a particular area, I can do my best to try to put you in contact with local disability groups. But if they don't seem to be much of one, it may really be that it's undeveloped. To the extent that there are resources out there that you can help identify. A lot of what we do is we train and support those disability groups. In Ukraine, for example, we're creating peer groups of people with disabilities and family members of children with disabilities. And that's an investment that needs to happen. You're not going to have good care and you're not going to have community integration without investing the resources and creating these community organizations. And that needs to be, that's a message that in terms of getting to the higher level, the big development people, we actually have legislation in the US Congress that is pending right now to create a program through the US Department of State that would support advocacy for this very purpose, to keep kids and their families and integrated into the community. And maybe I should have thought about this earlier, but we're having a listening session with members of Congress tomorrow at 3 p.m. I'm heading off there now. I've got to get to the train station, but we have an online version of it. Let me put my email in the chat. And if any of you are interested in weighing in and letting members of Congress know how important this is, we would certainly welcome your support. So I'm putting my email in the chat ad right now, and let us know if you're interested, and we'd love to have you join this discussion. I'm going to catch a train now.
Thanks, Eric. Good luck with that, and thanks for your expertise and everything you do.
Okay.
And Sarah, any final words to close?
No, just thank you. Thank you so much for having us, and I'm happy to, if anyone is interested in continuing the conversation. I guess the one thing I would like to finish is just when we're working with children to make sure that we're empowering also their caregivers and their parents, that they're an integral. I mean, it's one and the same. You know, working parents and working with parents and working with children is really important. So thank you very much, and I'll put my email as well in chat for anyone who's interested.
Okay, thank you everyone who joined today. Please feel free to be in touch. And if you have other dilemmas, other questions about this, we're happy to put you in touch with the right people and hope to see you at a future Aspire program.